She was just a waitress in a quiet town cafe, until one man walked in and changed everything. What happened next? You won't believe it. Stick around. And if you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story that matters. The cracked bell above the door gave its usual half-hearted jingle as Maya Harris stepped into Rosie's diner before sunrise. The world outside was still wrapped in a gray-blue hush, the kind of quiet that clings to small, tired towns like a second skin. Willow Ridge hadn't changed in the 5 years she'd been gone. Same faded storefronts, same gossip loops, same narrow glances from people who pretended not to see you until they did. She dropped her worn messenger bag behind the counter and grabbed a fresh towel, her fingers moving automatically as she wiped down booths that hadn't seen customers in hours. Rosie's wasn't just a job. It was the last anchor she had left. After the stroke that left her father speechless and mostly bedridden, Maya dropped out of college in Atlanta, returned home, and stepped back into a life she thought she had outgrown. Now it wrapped around her again like a coat she never meant to wear twice. The tips barely covered her father's medication, let alone the late utility bills or groceries. Some days she considered leaving, just packing up and running. But every time she looked at her father, she stayed. She wasn't just working a job, she was trying to hold together the last piece of family, of dignity. By 6, the place began to stir. A few of the regulars filtered in. Joe, with his trucker cap and his creaky knees. Miss Lorraine, who always brought her crossword and left exact change. And Marvin, who came for the blueberry pie and left after 3 slices and a nap. Maya smiled at them like always, her face a practiced mask of ease. They never asked much, and she never offered. None of them knew the full truth about what happened last year. The argument with the manager at her college job, the police report that mysteriously disappeared, the bruises on her arms that faded before anyone cared enough to notice. Willow Ridge was small, and secrets didn't stay buried long. But this one, she carried alone. It was nearing 7:30 when the door opened again, and someone new stepped inside. Not new exactly. He looked like someone from another time. A tall man, shoulders wide as the doorway, with a tan cowboy hat that shaded deep-set eyes. His boots clicked on the floor, slow and steady, and he walked with the weight of someone who had nothing to prove. Maya straightened a little. He wasn't just imposing. He was familiar in that larger-than-life way. People didn't walk like that unless they'd seen things, been through things. He didn't look around. He headed straight for the booth in the corner, sat down like he owned the gravity in the room, and waited. She approached with a notepad in hand, her voice measured. "Morning, coffee?" He nodded once. "Black, and whatever eggs you've got." There was something about his voice. Quiet, but it pulled attention like a magnet. She brought the coffee, placed it gently in front of him, and for a moment their eyes met. His gaze lingered just a second too long, and she knew he'd noticed the faint bruise beneath her sleeve. He didn't ask, just nodded again in thanks. She turned away quickly, flustered without knowing why. He stayed silent while he ate. Occasionally, he'd glance out the window as if watching something in the past. When he was halfway through his eggs, she refilled his cup. "You passing through?" she asked softly. He looked up. "You could say that." She tilted her head. "On business?" "Something like that." He paused. "Name's Chuck Norris." Her eyebrows lifted before she could stop herself. "That Chuck Norris?" He smiled, just a hint. "I've heard that before." Maya chuckled nervously and wiped her hands on her apron. "Well, you're safe here. We don't get a lot of celebrities." "I'm not here for attention," he said simply. Then, with a glance toward the kitchen, "You always work alone?" She stiffened slightly. "Today, yes. Cooks don't come in until lunch." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. "Place like this shouldn't leave someone like you uncovered." Her breath caught, but she shook her head. "I can handle myself." He looked at her carefully, measuring the weight behind those words. He nodded again, but said nothing more. At 8:15, the mood shifted. The bell above the door clanged hard, and 3 figures stepped in, cutting the sunlight with their shadows. All 3 wore leather, scuffed, heavy, and crested with insignias. Maya recognized them instantly. Local bikers from a club that claimed to protect the town, but mostly protected their own power. The leader, Flint, a bald man with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, scanned the room with smug satisfaction. Behind him followed Chet and Dale, muscle-bound and mean, both in thick boots and chains. Maya's fingers tightened on the coffee pot. She turned slightly, ready to retreat behind the counter, but Flint was already grinning at her. "Look what the cat dragged in," he said loudly, drawing the eyes of everyone present. "Maya, still playing Waitress? Thought you'd have left by now." She forced a smile. "Coffee?" "Sure, why not?" he said, settling into the booth across from Chuck without asking. Chuck didn't move. He simply took a sip of his coffee, eyes still fixed on the window. Dale slid in next to him, jostling the table. Chet leaned against the counter, smirking. As Maya set down the coffee in front of them, Flint accidentally bumped the cup, sending the scalding liquid splashing across the table and down her apron. "Oh, no," he said, mock concern in his voice. "Clumsy, clumsy." Maya flinched at the burn, backing away instinctively. Behind her, someone gasped. Joe lowered his newspaper. Miss Lorraine sat frozen, her pen hovering mid-word. Chuck put down his cup. "I think," he said quietly, "you just made your last mistake." Flint turned to him, laughing. "Oh, yeah? What are you going to do, old man? Hit me with a fortune cookie?" Chuck stood, slowly, deliberately. He looked over each of the 3 men, one by one. "You humiliated a woman doing her job. You spilled coffee on her. You mocked her in public. And now you're interrupting my breakfast." The last word fell like a hammer. Dale lunged first, but Chuck moved faster. He caught the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him face first into the table with a thud. Chet barely had time to step forward before Chuck swept his legs out from under him, dropping him flat on his back with a precise boot to the chest. Flint reached for something in his jacket, but Chuck was already there, grabbing his wrist, twisting until a switchblade clattered to the floor. With a final shove, Flint stumbled backward, knocking over a chair and hitting the wall. The room was dead silent. Chuck looked around, adjusted his collar, and then turned to Maya. "You all right?" She nodded slowly, heart pounding. "Good. Let's finish that breakfast." Flint groaned on the floor. "You're dead, old man. You don't know who we are." Chuck turned his head slightly, voice calm as stone. "I know exactly who you are, and I'm not impressed." The men scrambled up and staggered out of the diner, dragging their pride behind them. Chuck returned to his seat. Maya, still shaken, brought him a fresh cup. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I don't like bullies," he said, "especially the kind that think no one's watching." Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting long streaks of gold across the dusty street. But inside Rosie's diner, something had shifted. And for the first time in a long time, Maya felt like she wasn't alone. The wind outside Rosie's diner had picked up by the time Maya stepped out to throw the trash. Dust blew across the empty street like forgotten whispers, but inside, the air was heavy and still. She stared down the road for a long moment, watching for signs of the biker's return. But there was only silence and the distant rattle of a delivery truck a few blocks away. She pulled her sweater tighter around her and went back inside. Chuck Norris was still seated at his booth, calmly finishing what was left of his breakfast like nothing had happened. The broken chair had been propped against the wall, and Maya had mopped up the spilled coffee with quiet determination. The regulars had either paid and left in a hurry or pretended nothing happened, keeping their eyes low and their heads down. That was Willow Ridge, silent when it mattered most. Maya refilled Chuck's coffee one more time. Her hands still trembled slightly. "You really weren't afraid," she said, not a question but a quiet observation. Chuck looked up at her. "I've been afraid before, but not of cowards." She leaned against the counter for support, glancing toward the door. "They'll be back. They always come back." "Then I'll still be here," Chuck replied simply. Maya wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe someone could just walk into her life and make the fear go away, even for a moment. But fear, in her experience, didn't leave quietly. It lingered in the bones. As the sun rose higher, Maya's anxiety deepened. Every time a car slowed outside, her heart jumped. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. 2 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize and 1 message from her landlord reminding her that rent was past due. The tension in her chest coiled tighter. Around midday, Chuck stood up and walked toward the counter. He placed a few bills down, far more than the cost of his meal. "You don't owe me anything," Maya said quickly. He paused, then slid the money closer to her side. "It's not for the food." Before she could answer, he tipped his hat slightly and stepped outside. She watched him go, part of her hoping he'd stay. Another part terrified of what might happen if he did. An hour later, the door opened again. Maya flinched, but it was only Marvin, back for his second helping of pie. She managed to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. By late afternoon, word had already begun to spread. Miss Lorraine's sister from the beauty salon down the block stopped in for a quick lemonade and stayed for half an hour, casually asking if the old guy who dropped Flint like a sack of flour was still around. Maya gave no comment, but she noticed the shift, the way people entered the diner with curiosity instead of contempt. And then the silence broke. The door burst open again. Not with the lazy jingle of regulars, but the aggressive clatter of boots. Flint was back, and this time he wasn't alone. 5 men followed behind him, all wearing the same patched vest, all with cold, heavy stares. Maya froze behind the counter. Her breath caught. Marvin stood halfway up from his booth, then quietly sat back down, sliding his plate away like he didn't want to be noticed. Flint stepped forward. His face was still red from the morning's humiliation, but now it twisted with purpose. "Where's the cowboy?" he barked. Maya said nothing. One of the others stepped closer to the counter. "We asked you a question." Still, she said nothing. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. Flint sneered. "Figures. Hides behind a girl. Typical." A tense beat passed. Then a voice came from the doorway. Calm, solid, icy. "No one hides behind Maya." The entire diner turned. Chuck stood there again, hands at his sides, relaxed as if this were just another stop in his day. But his eyes, those eyes cut through steel. The man closest to the counter started toward him. Chuck stepped in fast, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. He pushed him forward, sending him crashing into an empty table. "Enough," Chuck said loudly, his voice filling the room like thunder. Flint reached for his waistband, but Chuck was already in front of him, kicking his legs out from under him. Flint hit the floor hard, groaning. The others hesitated. There was something different about this man. Not just strength, but certainty. He wasn't angry. He wasn't wild. He was control personified. Chuck looked around at the others. "Pick your friend up. Walk out. Don't come back." No one moved. Now, they obeyed. Once the door closed behind them, Maya sank onto a stool, her body given out from tension. Chuck walked to her, grabbed a towel, and handed it to her. "They won't try again. Not like that." She looked up at him, tears welling up in her eyes. "How do you know?" "Because people like that only win when no one stands up. You stood up, and now they know they're being watched." That night, after closing the diner, Maya sat in the back booth with Chuck. The place smelled of old coffee and cleaning supplies. Her hands wrapped around a cup of tea as she stared into the distance. "Why did you come here?" she asked finally. Chuck thought for a moment. "I was passing through, but when I saw you, I saw someone who reminded me of someone I failed to protect a long time ago." Maya didn't press. Instead, she nodded, accepting the weight behind his words. "I've been on my own a long time," she said, tired of asking for help. "Then don't ask," he said, "just let it happen." The silence between them was full of understanding. When he stood to leave, Maya called after him. "Will you come back tomorrow?" He turned to her, tipping his hat again. "If you open the door, I'll be there." As he walked into the night, Maya locked the door and stood there a moment longer, her palm resting against the glass. Outside, the street was empty, but something had changed. She wasn't alone anymore. Maya stood at the back door of the diner the next morning, staring at the cracked concrete behind the building. The morning light hadn't yet reached the alley, and a thin fog clung to the ground like the ghosts of yesterday. She clutched her keys tighter than necessary and breathed in slow and deep. The air smelled of coffee grounds oil, and come in trouble she'd barely slept a few hours at most, spent staring at the ceiling wondering what would happen next. Her phone buzzed just as she unlocked the door, another message from the landlord. This one less patient. She ignored it, shoved the phone back into her pocket, and stepped inside. Flicking on the lights, one by one, Rosie's diner lit up in sections like a stage being prepared for a play. A quiet, familiar rhythm. Maya filled the coffee pots, turned on the griddle, and tried to settle the knot in her stomach. She kept glancing towards the door, half hoping, half dreading that Chuck would return. Maybe it was foolish to expect him again. She didn't even know where he'd come from or where he was going. The man was a mystery, but he'd stood up for her in a way no one ever had, and that wasn't something you could forget. By 8, the regulars trickled in slower than usual, and quieter too. Joe sat by the window, nursing his coffee, without his usual grumbles. Miss Lorraine didn't even bring her crossword. Marvin peeked in through the door and then turned around, muttering something about not wanting to get caught in any more action. The others who did come barely looked at Maya, let alone spoke to her. The message was clear. Don't make waves. Don't bring heat down on the town. She tried not to let it sink into her bones, but it did, like a slow chill seeping through the cracks of her resolve. The bruise on her arm from yesterday's coffee burn still throbbed gently underneath her sleeve, and the silence around her was heavier than the worst insults, at least those you could answer. This quiet was sharp and suffocating. At 10 o'clock, the front door opened again, and Maya straightened too quickly, but it wasn't Chuck. It was a woman. Tall, lean gray hair braided down her shoulder. She wore a denim vest over a faded flannel shirt, and her eyes were soft but sharp. They scanned the room quickly and landed on Maya with purpose. "Maya Harris?" she asked, voice calm, sure. Maya nodded. I'm Sarah Cates. I ride with the North Pine Guardians." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her back pocket and placed it gently on the counter. Maya unfolded it slowly. It was a handwritten note, a short one. "Heard what happened. I'm sorry they did that. You remind me of someone strong, someone who made me better. Hold fast." Chuck below the signature was a small sketch, a symbol Maya didn't recognize until Sarah tapped it with her finger. "That's our mark. Chuck rode with us once years ago, doesn't do it anymore. But people remember when he speaks, folks listen. I'm here to help if you'll have it." Maya blinked slowly, overwhelmed. "Help? How?" Sarah smiled. "By being present, by not letting them run you into the ground, by reminding this town they're not untouchable." Maya laughed bitterly. "That's exactly what they think they are." "Not anymore," said Sarah firmly. She nodded toward the window. "You'll see." Maya walked to the glass and looked out. What she saw made her breath hitch. Parked across the street were half a dozen motorcycles riders leaning against them. Arms crossed, relaxed, but watchful. They weren't the same men who'd stormed in with flint. These were older, rougher, but their energy was different. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to protect. As Maya turned back to Sarah, the woman added, "We're not here to fight unless we have to. Just here to show the people of Willow Ridge that someone sees you, someone stands with you. You didn't deserve what happened, and you shouldn't have to face it alone." The weight in Maya's chest shifted ever so slightly. It didn't disappear, but it moved and left space for something else, something warmer. The rest of the day moved with a cautious rhythm. People came in, saw the bikes outside, and hesitated, but many still entered. They sat in silence or whispered quickly, but they didn't leave. Some even nodded at Maya when she passed their tables. A few left larger tips than usual. One young woman scribbled a small note on a napkin and handed it to her on the way out. "You're brave. Thank you for not backing down." Maya folded it and tucked it into her apron, her hand brushing it occasionally, like a secret she wanted to keep close. Chuck didn't come that day, but the message he'd left behind grew louder in his absence. By afternoon, the diner was fuller than it had been in weeks, and Sarah was still there, quietly sipping coffee in the back corner, nodding to each person who dared to meet her gaze. Around 3, a local deputy walked in. Not Dean Harper, but a younger officer she didn't recognize. He approached, cautiously, removed his hat, and asked for a cup of coffee to go. Maya poured it without comment, but her hands shook just a little when she handed it over. "You all right?" the deputy asked hesitantly. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, then stopped. "No, actually I'm not, but I'm working on it." He nodded awkwardly, as if unsure how to respond, and left without another word, but even that mattered. Small cracks in the wall were starting to appear that evening after close. Maya walked outside with Sarah. They leaned against the edge of the building, watching the sun sink behind the rooftops of Willow Ridge. The motorcycles still lined the far curb. Riders standing in small clusters, chatting quietly or checking their bikes. "Why did you come, really?" Maya asked. Sarah looked at her and then out at the horizon. "Because silence is dangerous, and sometimes all it takes is one person saying no for others to remember. They can, too. I've seen towns like this before. They rot from fear, from complicity, from comfort, but not today. Not if we stand long enough to make them uncomfortable." Maya was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want to believe that." Sarah smiled. "You already do. You just haven't admitted it yet." Maya nodded, her eyes glistening in the last of the daylight. She didn't say anything else, but in her chest something sparked again. Not just survival, but resistance. Not just anger, but fire. As the motorcycles roared to life and pulled away into the twilight, Maya watched them go, a line of chrome and thunder disappearing into the fading light. She turned back toward the diner, feeling the echo of their presence behind her. She locked the door, turned off the lights, and stood for a long while in the quiet feeling the difference one day could make. The town hadn't changed yet, not really, but she had, and that was enough to begin. The next morning, Maya opened the diner before the sun had touched the tops of the buildings, her fingers still numb from sleep and nerves. She moved through the space like a whisper, flipping chairs down from tables set in water to boil, checking that the coffee grounds were stocked. She paused once at the wall near the window, where the plaster still held a small dent from where one of the bikers' heads had struck during Chuck's first visit. It had never been repaired, and she didn't mind seeing it now. It reminded her of something that couldn't be undone. There was a weight to the air outside, as if the whole town was waiting for something. Maya noticed it when she walked out to take a crate of empty soda bottles to the alley. A man across the street watched her for a long second before quickly pretending to look elsewhere. A curtain shifted in an apartment above the laundromat. People were seeing her and not pretending otherwise anymore. By 9, the street outside Rosie's diner began to stir in a way that felt different, not just traffic or morning routines, but presence attention. And then at 9:15 the first bikes returned, not in 3s or 5s, but in dozens. Maya stood frozen behind the counter as motorcycles filled both sides of Main Street, chrome gleaming in the morning light, the low thunder of their engines vibrating the windows. They parked in orderly lines, some bearing flags, others marked with patches from different towns and chapters. The riders themselves dismounted calmly, talking quietly, helping each other straighten their vests and helmets. No aggression, no chaos. Only unity and purpose. Sarah entered first again, this time wearing a clean denim jacket with a black and silver emblem stitched on the back. She gave Maya a nod and gestured toward the street. "We said we'd stand with you, and we meant it. Word got out across chapters. Some of them rode all night just to be here," she said. Maya swallowed hard, the lump in her throat rising fast. I don't even know what to say. "You don't have to say anything. They're not here for thanks. They're here for you because someone like Chuck saw something worth protecting, and we trust him, and we see it too." The bell jingled, and the first group stepped inside, respectfully removing sunglasses and greeting Maya with warm smiles, nods, and firm handshakes. They took seats without waiting to be told, some in booths, some at the counter, others standing along the walls. They didn't order all at once. They didn't demand. They waited calmly, filling the space with quiet energy. Maya began serving coffee automatically, muscle memory guiding her hands, but her mind barely caught up. Then came Roy and Linda, Chuck's old friends. They entered together, hands clasped, smiles quiet and sincere. Roy approached the counter first. "You're Maya Harris," he said. She nodded. "And you're Chuck's friends?" "Yes, he told us what happened. We wanted to see for ourselves. He's a good judge of character." Maya gave a small, tight smile. "I think he saved my life." Linda leaned in. "And you gave him hope? That's not something he finds often." Roy stepped aside, and more riders entered until the diner was filled beyond what it had ever seen. Maya was overwhelmed, but not alone. Volunteers began helping without asking. One man took over the coffee refills, another found the napkin holder and began folding them into fans. A woman in braided leather set up a small music player in the corner, and classic rock drifted softly through the air. Outside, locals had begun to gather across the street, staring in silence, some with confusion, others with fear, but a few with curiosity. Maya noticed Malik, a high school friend of hers from years ago, walking hesitantly toward the entrance. He paused at the door, looking at the sea of leather jackets and battle-worn faces, then stepped inside with a grin. "You still serving those biscuits?" he asked. Maya laughed, a sound she hadn't made freely in weeks. "Always." "You might have to share a table, though," she added. He shrugged and slid in next to a woman with a buzz cut and a patch reading "Steel Hearts." The two of them struck up a conversation within moments, like old friends. The atmosphere shifted slowly as more townspeople approached, peering in, stepping back, peeking again. A few entered cautiously at first, ordering coffee quietly, then sitting longer than usual by noon. The diner was full of riders, locals, and conversations crossing invisible lines. The smell of grilled bacon and strong coffee mingled with the scent of worn leather and engine oil. Maya moved between tables, her apron smudged her hands, quick, her smile growing more genuine with each passing hour. This was something different, something powerful, something alive. She caught Sarah's gaze once across the room, and the woman simply nodded as if to say, "You're doing it." Around 1 o'clock, the bell rang again, and the room fell quiet as a broad-shouldered man stepped inside, his beard white and thick, his vest marked with bold patches and heavy silver pins. He looked around once, then smiled warmly and extended a hand toward Maya. "You must be the one Chuck told us about. I'm Marcus Turner, president of the Riverside chapter. We ride under the same legacy." "Chuck once did. You made an impression." Maya shook his hand, trying not to tremble. "Welcome to Rosie's Marcus." He turned to the room and raised his hand. The chatter died down instantly, the kind of silence that follows leadership. "I want to thank Miss Maya Harris," he began, voice smooth but commanding. "She stood alone when others turned away, when others bowed their heads. She lifted hers, and in our world that means something. It means everything." A wave of quiet murmurs passed through the room, and Maya felt her throat tighten. "So, from this day forward, Rosie's Diner rides under the protection of the Guardian's Reaper's steel hearts, and every chapter that believes in standing for those who stood first," Marcus finished. The roar that followed shook the walls. Boots pounded fists, slammed tables. Maya stood stunned as people rose in cheer, some laughing, others shouting in support. She looked across the room and saw Linda clapping, Roy raising a glass, Sarah wiping at one eye, and Malik grinning at her like a fool. Then the bell rang again, and standing in the doorway was Chuck Norris, tired, dusty, sunburned, and smiling slightly. "Hope I'm not late," he said. Maya moved before she realized her feet were even responding. She met him halfway and wrapped him in a fierce hug. Something cracked open in her chest, something soft and steady. "You came back," she said. "I never left," he replied. As the afternoon rolled on, the diner spilled into the street. Children on bikes weaved between motorcycles. Someone played Leonard Skinner on an old speaker, and laughter echoed off the buildings like it hadn't in years. Maya looked around the crowd at faces new and old and saw no fear, no judgment, only welcome, and the fire that had sparked in her days ago now burned strong and bright. The sun dipped low behind the rooftops of Willow Ridge, casting long golden shadows across Main Street as Rosie's Diner slowly quieted. The last plates were cleared. The last customers leaned back in their chairs, and the scent of fried food, coffee, and motorcycle oil lingered in the air like the memory of something important. Maya stood behind the counter, her apron stained, her hair pulled back messily. Her cheeks still flushed from laughter and heat. She looked out across the room filled with people who only days ago would have passed each other in silence and now talked like neighbors, maybe even like friends. The bikers had not just come and gone. They had stayed throughout the day, working, cleaning, holding doors open, sharing food and stories. They didn't act like intruders or outsiders. They acted like community. and as the last sunlight slipped beneath the horizon, their presence remained steady, solid, a protective circle around the little diner that had become a symbol of resistance and hope. Chuck sat quietly at his usual booth sipping coffee, his eyes tracking the room slowly. Not as a guard, but as someone taking it all in, Maya brought him another refill and sat down across from him for the first time, not out of fear or necessity, but because she wanted to. "You ever think a place like this could change?" she asked, her voice soft, her hand wrapped around her cup. Chuck looked at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Places change when people do, and people change when someone gives them a reason to." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the wall where someone had taped a photograph from earlier in the day. It showed her standing at the pass-through window, tray in hand, laughing while one of the bikers made a ridiculous face. Behind her, the picture was slightly crooked, pinned with a fork, but it radiated something real. "I didn't plan this," she said. "I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to survive." "You did more than survive," Chuck replied. "You showed everyone what it looks like to stand alone until others decide they won't let you anymore." Maya blinked hard against the sudden sting in her eyes, the exhaustion of the week pressing down all at once. But underneath it was something else, something steadier and stronger, the knowledge that she hadn't backed down. And because of that, the world around her had bent just a little toward justice. Outside, she heard another motorcycle start up, then another, the rumble rising and falling like a heartbeat. Roy and Linda stepped inside one last time. Roy carried a brown paper-wrapped package and handed it to her with a proud smile. "From all of us," he said, "a thank you and a promise." Maya opened the package slowly, careful not to tear the wrapping inside. Folded with care was a custom leather vest, black and smooth across the back. Stitched in gold thread were the words "Rosie's Diner," encircled by a symbol she now recognized, a wheel surrounded by wings and flame. Beneath it, a smaller patch read, "Friend of the Guardians." She pressed her hand to the embroidery, as if grounding herself against the weight of it, the meaning, the belonging. Linda touched her shoulder gently. "You earned this, not because of who you served, but how you did it, and because you didn't look away." Tears slid silently down Maya's face, but her smile was bright, clear, honest. She didn't try to hide them anymore. The riders began to leave one by one, not in a rush, but in waves. Some stopped to hug her, others just nodded solemnly before disappearing into the deepening dusk. Children waved from sidewalks, neighbors peeked from porches, and no one stopped the procession as it rolled slowly out of town, leaving behind not fear but awe. Chuck stood to go, and Maya followed him to the door. The wind tugged lightly at her vest, now draped proudly over her shoulders, the patch shining under the porch light. "So, where to now?" she asked as he adjusted his hat. Chuck glanced toward the horizon. "There's always another diner somewhere, always another fight someone's too tired to finish." Maya nodded, then reached into her apron and pulled out the napkin, the one from a few days ago with the words scribbled in careful handwriting. "You're brave." "Thank you for not backing down." She handed it to him. "Just in case you ever forget why you keep riding." He took it, folded it slowly, tucked it into his jacket, and smiled. "I won't." He turned, stepped down the stairs, and swung onto his motorcycle. The engine roared to life, then settled into a steady rhythm. He looked at her one last time, gave her a small, two-fingered salute, and pulled away down the road, disappearing into the warm, quiet dark. Maya stood on the steps for a long time, arms crossed, vest snug around her shoulders. Behind her, the diner buzzed with the final sounds of cleaning laughter and music, a place reborn in fire and defiance and kindness. Later that night, As she locked up alone for the first time in days, she paused at the photo on the wall, and next to it hung her father's old apron, stained and faded. But, still proud, she smiled softly and hung the vest beside it, symbols of old strength and new stitched together under the same roof, and just before turning off the lights, she looked out the window one last time and whispered to the empty street, "I'm not backing down tomorrow either." Then she turned and walked into the kitchen, steam rising in the background, the scent of fresh coffee already starting again. The first sound of a new morning, one act of courage can ripple through an entire town. What would you have done? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. More powerful stories are on the way.